throw your uppercut, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, only the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating. Yeah, my legend's written in the stone. Yeah, you're crying age in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, only the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round.
Political corruption. We are going to restore honor to our government. In my administration, I'm going to enforce all laws concerning the protection of classified information. No one will be above the law.
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. We actually had a downtime scheduled today. Commander McMillan and I were just going to sort of shoot the shit, but recently a couple of topics have been dominating most of our conversations anyway, and with all of this talk about Trump, which is, I think, the news is actually downplaying the significance of it, but we've discussed that already. We carried that live, and we're going to continue to discuss it, but there's been a lot going on in Ukraine, and we felt that it was a good idea to have a show dedicated to discussing what's been changing there and what we think is likely to happen, if we can prognosticate, in the near future. Commander McMillan has been on the Discord a lot. He's been answering questions, and we've been talking to him for the most part just about every day. This is where I was about to do the self-deprecating joke. He's putting up with us, but that's what he does too. So we're all pretty it's that's all we've got is the self-deprecating humor. Lance is, well, why on earth do we have him? We're sitting there going like, we're not worthy, but we've got him. He's here.
Tell him everything you know, Nick.
Yes.
And then I'll tell him what I know, and it won't take a second longer.
Yeah, we'll be all right. That was a great show, folks. Thank you all so much for coming. And then tomorrow we're going to have Operator Starsky on, and hopefully Lance will be able to join us for that. And looking forward to that. He's Ukrainian National Guard. He has a lot to say about what's going on over there, and it's good to have a resource that's actually really in it. In Ukraine. So we're going to be speaking with Operator Starsky tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you guys will join us for that. In the meantime, 𝗲𝗫, thank you. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. Glad you could make it on short notice because we switched up the schedule.
Yeah, you said it was a downtime, so I'm like in bed in my 90s sipping a martini.
Even I don't get to drink martini. What the hell, dude? I have been grossly misinformed about the life of a trucker. Yeah. Okay. So
I tried to show you. When I was there, I tried to show you, but you were like, "Oh yeah, that's nice," and then I'm getting the hell out of here because that's sketchy as all get out.
Yeah. We're at the truck stop, and yeah. All right. So a story for another time. Commander, thank you very much for joining us. There's been a lot going on since the breakthrough a couple of weeks ago, the wildly successful Ukrainian counteroffensive for about 60 days. It looked like they were going to attack in one place, and instead they hit somewhere else in the northern section of that front line there. It seems to have utterly collapsed. They were having command and control issues, complete disarray and disorganization, and we now have Putin doing a couple of things. First of all, we have the suggestion that he may declare 4 areas in Ukraine as part of Russia, and then argue that the Ukrainian army there is actually an invader, and they have a right to defend their lands against the ruthlessly invading Ukrainians. I have no idea what wormhole we stepped through to have that narrative, but and him calling up 300,000 more troops. I don't know how he could deploy 3,000, but
more on that later.
Yes, I think we're going to have to dive into that. So the threat of using nuclear weapons to defend themselves has drawn considerable backlash at the UN and seems to have alarmed NATO. So I guess the questions that we have are what's going on there right now, how serious is he, and what are his prospects for success going forward, and go. I've noticed I tend to pack a lot into my questions.
That was a question. It looked like more of you just reading the headlines and me having to sit here going, okay, well, I'm glad I don't have to talk about it now.
If you could just go ahead
left out.
Yeah. Sorry, Xander. What?
He's left out the red call box. Has got to be in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you could just go ahead and answer everything that's going on in Ukraine. So let's talk about what's been going on over the last couple of days in Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, so we'll start with the offensive, which kicked off, I think, about 2 weeks ago, if I remember correctly. The Ukrainians, in a matter of 5 days, took an enormous swath of territory, basically liberated the entire area of the Kharkov Oblast, which is up in the northeast of the country. Kharkov is a big industrial city, or at least was before the fighting. A lot of people thought that once they reached the river line up there, and I can't remember the name of the river, but when they reached that river line, they would stop, bring in defensive forces, and pull their offensive arm out of the line to refurbish it, reorganize, replace losses, and then send that force somewhere else. It doesn't look like that's happening. It looks like they're continuing to conduct the assault. They may well be on the verge of encircling a fairly significant crossroads town, and if they do that, it will probably net them another couple thousand prisoners. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out. One thing we do know is that area before the attack was the operational area of the Russian 1st Guards Tank Army, which is one of their big offensive forces. And it effectively has ceased to exist. And in the panic that was ensuing as the offensive was gaining great ground, they threw in the only reserve that they have, which is a recently stood up group of reservists in the 3rd Army Corps. And they sent that to back up the 1st Guards Tank Army. They routed. These are guys who showed up and got maybe a week, 2 weeks worth of training.
Jeez.
And, operating with second line equipment and such, and they ran. So effectively, the Russian General Reserve has ceased to exist. The northern arm of their army, the 1st Guards Tank, is gone. So that's why you get this sudden desperate move of declaring this allegedly partial mobilization. It's important to understand the sequencing that went on, and I think it gives you a little insight into a lot of what was driving it, because they had announced they were going to make this big declaration, and Putin was going to give this speech, and everybody assumed it was going to be something like this partial mobilization order. And then they said, oh, no, delay it all for 24 hours. And 24 hours later, they did make the announcement, partial mobilization. They said they were bringing 300 reservists into active service. And within an hour of that announcement being made across the breadth of Russia, there were Interior Ministry people knocking on folks' doors and dragging young men out into the buses. And I'm guessing that the one-day delay was to make sure that the MVD people were in position to start snagging these people, the reservists, because as soon as the announcement was made, the border crossings were mobbed. Prices on airline tickets skyrocketed, anything that would get you out of Russia. And yeah, Ed, there are big protests going on, not just in the big cities, which is where they've been taking place, but apparently in smaller cities as well. So there's a lot of anger and disgruntledness about this declaration. And as a codicil or an amendment to that, we're now getting through back channel information from people in Russia that while they said 300,000, it may actually be as many as a full million who are being mobilized. Yeah. Now, I'm going to be echoing a few of the things that I wrote on the Discord page, but I think it's important for people who don't read on the Discord page. The key thing to understand is that Russian reservists are not American reservists. American reservists drill once a month for 2 days, and then once a year, they do a 2-week training period. So these guys are relatively fresh on keeping up with developments, understand how to be still a functional soldier. For the average Russian, you're automatically entered into the reserves. It's not a volunteer kind of thing. You automatically enter in the reserves when you finish your conscript time, and once every 2 to 3 years, the Ministry of the Interior is supposed to send you a postcard. And your job is to take said postcard and say, yes, I still live at the address that you sent the postcard to. And you mail it back in. That's the total involvement in military training that the average Russian reservist has. And if you look at the pictures of some of these reservists who are just now being mobilized and put onto these buses, they're in their like mid 40s or 50s. So some of these guys could well be in a situation where it's been 20 plus years since they were in uniform, let alone handled a weapon. And these guys are, if they're lucky, going to get a month or two of training before they're sent to the front. But if things are as bad as they are, particularly in the northern sector where they're in desperate need of just bodies to throw into trenches, a lot of these guys are literally going to get handed, like that scene from Enemy at the Gates. They're going to be handed a rifle. The other guy will be handed a thing of bullets, and they say, when he drops his after he's killed, you pick up his rifle and you can load it now. And that's kind of the level of absurdity that this is devolving into, I think. And remember, this is occurring just before the onset of winter. How much you want to bet these guys aren't given really good winter gear? No, muddy boot, snowshoes, winter coats, heaters, ponchos, any of that stuff is likely to be given to them. You're going to have...
What's the average temperature during winter down there?
It's below freezing. They will get snow. You can get upwards of, 2 or 3 feet of snow on the ground at any given time. Smaller rivers will freeze over solid. The larger ones, like the 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷 River and such, the Donets, those won't freeze because they're much bigger, much deeper, wider. So, yeah, winter's going to be bad. They've already lost huge numbers of trucks. So trying to keep these guys supplied with food is going to be tough. In fact, we know that a general order has already been issued in some sectors that say, no food's coming, boys, forage. So they're breaking into people's houses and stores and everything and stealing food just to survive. This is the army, the armed mob that the Russian army has become.
I have to believe that's pretty bad for
quantity
morale.
Has a quality all its own.
I'm sorry, what?
I said quantity has a quality all its own.
Well, and I have to. So we have units deserting. We have almost immediate routes as soon as they meet, and they have more experience than the reservists that are being called up now.
Oh yeah,
and they've already been having extreme difficulties getting ammunition, fuel, food to the soldiers anywhere near the front lines. How many of let's be as conservative as possible and say that even just 300,000. What percentage of that could they actually mobilize?
I think a lot depends on how they intend to employ these guys. So a smart move would be to take all these reservists, and send them to non-combat area sectors. So you send them to the border of, Poland, or you send them to the Far East, or you send them, up on the Finnish border, or what have you. And then you take more experienced troops who've had some time in uniform and presumably have had some degree of training, and you use those guys to fill the slots at the front. But we also know that they've already been drawing down a lot of those units to send people to the front. So how much of that they can do, I don't know. And there's also a question of how much risk they're willing to accept on those other non-active sectors to send those people and replace them with nobodies. So my guess is to see a little of that, but most of these guys are going to getting pushed right into the front lines. It's like that scene from the movie I just alluded to. I think they're desperate enough at this stage. They don't want to lose any more of the terrain they already took, so they're just going to throw warm bodies into the trenches. How many of them are going to desert? How many of them are going to surrender? Will they start fragging their own officers? Will they mutiny? All of those are distinct possibilities. We know, for example, down in the Kherson region, which is in the south, not where the big offensive has been making such progress. There is an offensive going on down there, but it's much more slow and methodical. Anyway, we know in that sector that they have deployed what they call blocking groups in the rear areas on the bridges over the river down there to prevent people from deserting and running back towards Crimea. And that's under the, we'll arrest you, and if we can't arrest you, we'll shoot you to prevent you from deserting. And now what's happening? There are reports that people on the other side, so not in the threatened bridgehead area, but on the far bank, they're starting to desert and run. And they're not even under direct threat. So that gives you an idea how much things are deteriorating everywhere. So yeah, I think this will be kind of like the opening months of World War II, where as guys showed up in uniform, whether they even were armed or not, they just get shipped straight into the front lines. We need bodies to slow the enemy advance down. How many of you die, we don't care. And I think that's, yeah. And we know that they don't have a huge amount of manpower to draw on. Their population has been declining. The ethnic Russian population does not have a high birth rate. It's not even enough to replace the current population. They're killing off essentially a generation of young men right now. That's going to be worse. And that's one of the problems is even when they've tried to just do, during peacetime, regular conscription, which they do twice a year for a 1-year period, they're still not getting the full number of people that they need to flesh out units for those regular non-fighting conscripts before the war even started. And now everybody has an added incentive to say, hell no, I'm not going. So
at this point, it's hard to see any game plan from Putin. What game plan does he have? Now, I'd asked you this question before. I'll ask again. I don't think anyone here thinks Putin is a stupid guy. He's actually extraordinarily intelligent. So what's he thinking?
I think at this point he's, and I've said this a couple times, I'll just say it again, I think he's the cornered rat. He's desperately looking for some way out of this sinking ship. Because if he can't find some way to extricate himself that lets him say, mission accomplished, where have we heard that before? If you can't say that, then everybody's going to turn around when it's over and say, look at everything that happened, all the bad things that have happened to us. Our army is broken beyond repair. Our economy is broken beyond repair. A huge portion of our young intelligentsia have fled the country and likely are not going to return anytime soon. This is all your fault, asshole. And if he's lucky, he'll be retired to a little dacha east of the Urals. If not, he'll be doing underground mushroom farming in anonymous woods outside Moscow.
Oh, yeah. Well, hope that'll be in good company out there. There's at least 4 million back there. So, all right. Well, we've heard about this referendum. What's the referendum, and what's he trying to do?
So, the referendum, as I understand it, and let's first off throw the concept of referendum, plebiscite, or whatever it is out the window. It isn't. They've already decided what the result is. It's not a, do you want to join Mother Russia, or would you prefer to be independent, or you want to rejoin Ukraine? They're not doing that. They've already made up their minds what the answer is going to be. All that really is in the air is what percentage. It's like right after Hitler annexed Austria, they held a plebiscite, do you want to unify with Germany? And 99.7% of the vote came back. Yes! What a surprise. It's going to be the same thing in Donetsk and Luhansk. It's going to be a yes. The real issue is, why is he doing it? And I think a lot of it is because it gives him a way to circumvent Russian law. And he's done that on a number of occasions. He's a master at playing the legal system to his advantage. If Donetsk and Luhansk are part of Russia as opposed to independent republics, the fact that there are any Ukrainian troops in either of those regions becomes an invasion of Russia. And he is allowed to employ any and all means without restriction to defend those areas of Mother Russia. It also means he can decide to arrest all of his political opponents. And, if his supporters are having all these accidents falling out of windows or downstairs, what do you think is going to happen to a political opponent who's arrested for being an enemy of the state?
Yeah, gravity is an issue for a lot of these people nowadays.
Yeah. The thing that gets me is there's a Russian blogger that I follow occasionally, and he was almost in tears the night the mobilization was declared, the night after. And he says, basically what this is the death of Russia. Because we had at least a semblance of something that was a constitution. There were laws that were in place that people were supposed to follow. And we at least made some pretense at the effort of trying to adhere to those laws. With this law change, by declaring these provinces part of Russia, allowing him all these emergency special powers, all that gets thrown out the window. He can essentially declare himself the new czar. He makes up his own constitution at that point. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing going on right now is, again, he's that cornered rat. He's desperate to find some way, any way, to save his own hide. Because there really isn't an alternative. He either has to win this war, which I think we've already seen isn't going to happen, or he has to find some way to, exit stage left very quietly with all his goodies and live out some sort of exile in Bujumbura or whatever. Those are the only two ways he survives.
Yeah, well, I think the first one is impossible, and the second one, his ego doesn't appear his ego is going to allow. The Sinister Porpoise. Let's see. Solve the 3N+1 problem. Send more troops to Ukraine. 3N+1. know I should know what that is, but I don't. Maybe Sinister will explain it. But thank you, Sinister, for your continued support of this channel.
He'll have to elaborate because I've never heard that before. The only thing I would think of as 3N was a silly war game that was published.
I'm sure it's computer science. My brain is fried. But yeah, I won't be able to recall that. So at this point, I mean, okay, so he's not going to win. There's no that I can tell. There's no path to victory for Russia at this point. The 300,000 or million, however many it is.
Yeah. Let me interrupt for just a sec. I agree. There's no way he can win, because even if he does somehow magically end up conquering Ukraine, he's basically turned all of Europe against him, if not a significant part of the rest of the world. So Russia becomes a completely isolated rogue state like North Korea. His economy is going to just collapse on itself. And they'll be fighting a guerrilla war in Ukraine for a minimum of 20 years. Even with the most brutal oppression, it will still take them 20 years to finally put it all down.
And I don't think anyone's going to lift the sanctions anytime soon either, but yeah.
Oh, hell no. Yeah, so even if he wins, he still loses.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to Sinister's explaining the math problem. I'll catch up with it in a minute. I'm a little bit like the squirrel. Yeah. So
is part of this, could part of this be the annexation of the kind of southern eastern parts of Ukraine and then declaring an invasion?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that some of that could be so that he could use more powerful weapons without, or with at least the pretense of justification to stop retaliation?
I think he wants that because he's one of that group of people who is convinced that automatically any democratic state, particularly the dilettantes of the West, that they're going to cave in. All he has to do is drop one tactical nuke somewhere and everybody's going to go, oh no, we give up, you can have Ukraine. I don't think he understands that he's already burned that bridge. And setting off a nuke is just as likely to trigger a full-scale NATO intervention. I'm not saying that they would invade Russia. I think that's well beyond what any of the alliance would support. But I do think there's a distinct possibility that at least some countries might actually send combat forces in to help the Ukrainians. And I'm not trying to denigrate the Ukrainians. They're not a top-tier military. They're not equipped or trained to the standards that many of the professional armies of NATO are. So if you end up with a situation where the Russian army has already been completely stopped and is in fact losing ground to the Ukrainian army, which I will not call them second string, but they're not first string. And then you throw in the first string NATO troops, it's, the fighting's over in a couple weeks probably if that happens. It'll look just like what happened with Saddam Hussein's third largest army in the world thing.
Well, and what was it? Russia was was considered the second best army in the world. Now they're barely the second best army in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So, did you have anything else?
Which Russian army are we talking about? Because that's another one of the problems. The Russians are effectively fighting the war in Ukraine with arguably 5 separate armies. And I don't mean First Army, Second Army, Third Army. I mean groups of troops that don't work together. So you've got, at the top right now, it's the private military company of, Wagner Group is the best known, but there's probably around a dozen of them. They're the best equipped, best trained people, but they're not answerable to military authority. They only do what their company owners tell them to do. Then you have the Russian army. Then you have, the special bodyguard forces like the Chechen group that came in, and there are several of those also involved. Then you have the Russian Ministry of the Interior forces, who don't listen to the army command. They have to hear all their orders direct from Moscow, from MVD. And then finally, you have these separate Luhansk and Donetsk private armies that they're basically cannon fodder, and everybody uses them as that. Is they have to obey whoever tells them to do anything, and it's like, we think there might be a minefield out there. Send 50 of your guys across that field and see if any blow up. I'm not kidding. That is literally what they're doing in some cases.
Wow.
Yeah, and you can imagine these poor guys who are literally just dragooned off the streets. It's you don't get time to call your wife and pick up your mittens. They throw you in the back of a truck, take you to the front, hand you a gun, and say, "Do this." Oh, you didn't? Bang. We'll get another guy next week. And all 5 of these organizations do not work together. So that's one of the reasons this offensive that occurred up north went so well, is certain key areas were being held by folks from the MVD and other areas by the 1st Guards Tank Army from the regular army, and they weren't talking to another. They weren't supporting one another. There was a significant MVD battalion that was left in Izium and was surrounded and had to surrender, because nobody from the army told them, "Hey, we're leaving. You might want to get in your trucks and drive this way." That's how chaotic and badly organized things are.
It's almost hard to believe they're having morale problems in the Russian army.
I know.
So, all right. So, is there anything that you can think of that we missed getting to where we are today? Any salient points or anything that we need to cover? Just in terms of, yeah, please.
Sure. I want to address 2 things. One, you keep hearing this repeated refrain from certain people that, well, the Russians have held their best troops out. They haven't sent their best troops into Ukraine. They're being held back to commit at the right moment, or they're being held back to watch NATO or whatever. That's total, complete BS. The Russians sent, because we know which are the best units, they sent all those in the initial waves. And those are basically destroyed now. And number 2, it's the question of what is likely to happen next. I think in the short term, the Kherson bridgehead is going to collapse in similar style to what you saw up north. It may take a little longer because the terrain there is not as favorable to an offensive operation, but they're making good progress down there already. I think as casualties mount, as they throw all these completely unprepared, unequipped troops into the line, as casualties go up, pressure back in the general population inside Russia is going to continue to rise until there's a trigger event. And traditionally, from Russian history, most of the times you have a revolution, it's because the army gets pissed off and takes out the authority. So I think that could be what happens here, is that the army, and it might even be actual army command as opposed to just the soldiers themselves, saying enough is enough and ending this. Could a nuke be dropped? Yeah, but as I said, I don't think that buys him anything unless he's, pulling the 𝗢𝗲𝗄𝐽 situation, the scenario where if I can't win, then everybody loses kind of thing.
I assume too, and we've had situations like this before, that it's possible that he could give the order to deploy a tactical nuke and it would not be followed. What do you think the likelihood of that would be?
Our command structure, the president makes the decision to employ. It goes to STRATCOM, and from STRATCOM it goes straight to the silos, the submarines, the aircraft, and they do their job. So it's basically a two-step process. President to STRATCOM, and then STRATCOM down to the forces. In Russia, it's about a 5 or 6 step process to get that order down there. And at any point, all you need is one guy to say, "What the hell? No." And they stop it. So there's a question of how sure are they that it'll happen. It depends on whether he's still believing his own propaganda or not. Then there's the added issue that a lot of the Russian nuclear inventory is kind of obsolete. One of the problems is many of their missiles that are still being used are not missiles that they have the ability to get spare parts for. Because guess where all those missiles were manufactured? In Ukraine. So that becomes an issue.
That's a beautiful irony right there. But yeah,
I know, isn't it though? And remind me about airplanes. I'll tell you that in a second. I want to finish this train of thought right now. The next thing that's interesting about that is that the missiles that they use have liquid fuel, which is highly corrosive. And most of these missiles haven't been overhauled or upgraded since they were built back during the Cold War. Every time they go through a exercise, they have to fuel those missiles with that caustic fuel, warm them up, and then shut it down and drain all the fuel out. And they've been doing this for, almost 30 years now. What do you think the state of those missiles is right now?
Probably not very good, I would imagine.
Kind of about what those trucks that you saw breaking down on the side of the road is. Now,
yeah.
I will be honest, all it takes is one to make everybody have a bad day. But I don't think that it's as hugely deadly a threat as it would have been back in, say, 85, because they really haven't made an effort to keep that stuff in peak condition.
Probably don't even have the economy to do it. So you were going to talk about the aircraft.
Oh. So a bunch of people were keeping track of things since the start of the war. At the start of the war, the Ukrainians had 12 Su-24 low-level medium bombers. They're at a low strike. They come in at very low altitude, under enemy radar, and they drop their bombs and turn around and head out. They had 12 of them at the start of the war. And because people had been able to track how things are going, because the Ukrainians are a little more open with the information, they knew that 11 of those had been lost in the first month of fighting. But what they're finding right now is that based on tail numbers of Su-24s they've been seen flying, there are at least 10 that are operational. Now, where did you get the other 9 airplanes?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that when the wall came down and Ukraine split off as a second country, its own entity, a lot of Russian material was simply abandoned in Ukraine. And you've talked about the Budapest Accords and such. It's along those levels. If they left it there. Now the Ukrainians didn't want it, didn't need it, so they put it into cold storage, basically. And apparently they've been doing a great job of pulling all these airplanes that haven't been even maintained. They were rusty and everything, taking them out, refurbishing them, and they now have a bunch flying again. So that shows you the ingenuity involved in what they're doing to keep their effort going.
Don't piss off the Ukrainians, Jesus.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, all right. So, I have, I think, sort of only one other big question I'm going to ask, and then I want to see if Xander has anything else he wants to say. But so, assuming that we're all essentially caught up to where we are with Ukraine and Russia in particular. What do you think is the most likely outcome of this going forward, and when?
I think Putin is convinced that if he just waits until winter, that Europe will basically give in. The cold, because, I'm going to blockade all the natural gas and you'll all freeze to death. And I don't think he has estimated correctly the sentiment of the people. Certainly not the governments of those countries. Yeah, they will be responsive to the demands of people for something to be done to take care of the energy pricing that they need to stay comfortable during the winter. But I don't think they're going to just say, oh, well, we give in, you win. And I think as things carry on through the winter, that situation is going to get progressively worse and worse on the front lines for the Russians. And I think that is going to probably bring about a realization amongst the inner circle that we need to do something to end this. And they can't end it as long as he's sitting on the throne. So I think he's going to go away at some point. That's my best guess. That could easily be wrong. It could be everything escalates and suddenly we have a much bigger and broader generalized war across the entire NATO-Russian frontier. I don't know. But I think if you're playing the rational minds game, I think the rational minds would say, we need to end it. We're losing far too much. Even if we win this war, we've still lost. It's time to extricate ourselves from this mess and try to come out of it with something resembling the functioning state.
You had mentioned
how long? I think, February, March next year.
Yeah, you had mentioned that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was largely due to the war in Afghanistan, and they've already lost more than they did in the war in Afghanistan. Do you think that the Russian Federation survives this, or do you think it splits up splits up in some way?
Well, I think you look at the casualties. We know that the Soviets lost about 8,500 troops over, 8 years, 10 years in Afghanistan. It wasn't a major cause, but it was a major contributory cause to what brought down the USSR. The current war, which has only lasted, 6 months now, roughly.
Something like that, yeah.
We know from internal documents that were supposed to be confined to just inside higher circles in Moscow that have somehow leaked out. We know from those that the Russians have admitted to 48,000 dead, not casualties, dead already. And that was back in early August.
Yeah, that was before the offensive, which has been killing them quickly.
I think we're easily up to 60 right now. We're in that vicinity. And that doesn't say anything about POWs, deserters, wounded. Typically, the formula that's used is between 3 to 4 wounded for every dead. So if the Russians went in, as they were claiming, with something like 175,000, that means pretty close to the entire opening force that they sent in have become casualties.
Jesus.
Yeah. So...
and now we had heard too that at least in some areas they're not even really bothering to hide the dead as much as they used to, and they're simply notifying families, oh, your son's been killed, and
they're not even telling the families. They're just not saying anything. Significant numbers of Russians are being informed of their son/husband's death by the Ukraine. The Ukrainians make a point of tallying up and getting information as best they can on all the dead Russian bodies they find, and then calling, using that information, into Russia to let them know, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband was killed in Ukraine. You can imagine the kind of pressure that's causing.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure in hindsight we're going to find fault with how the Ukrainians have done something or other. Nobody executes a war perfectly. It's messy business, but they have done a brilliant job and I remember when we had you on before, before the invasion, and we were talking about Russia trying to find a pretense to invade, and there was the school that was hit, and they said, "Oh, this school in Russia has been hit by the Ukrainians. We're going to invade." And less than an hour later, the Ukrainians were outside that school. They said, "Here's the street. The school is a Ukrainian school. Here's the school. This is where we are. Here we are on Google Maps." And this was hit by the Russians, the Russians hit a Ukrainian school. And it's like they were ready for this. And it looks like they've...
Well, it's a litany of one after the other of things like this coming out of Russia. And even the Russian people are now getting to the point where they don't trust their own media when it tells them something. They know it's all made up bullshit.
All right. Well, Xandring, did you have any other questions before we wrap this up?
I guess one, what I was asking about using more powerful weapons. I guess my personal view on this, and I don't know exactly where to pin this opinion exactly to. I guess just the conglomeration of everything that I've heard, read, learned. I'm not entirely convinced that, or at least when I was talking about more powerful weapons, I wasn't really talking about nuclear weapons, because there is such a price tag that comes with any nuclear weapons usage whatsoever. Even if you're claiming you're trying to defend your own territory and you use a nuclear weapon, because that's a global effect weapon. So
absolutely,
there is just there's just so much baggage accompanied with that. But there are a lot of other, especially chemical mass effect weapons that can be used that don't carry that same kind of stigma, at least in the general public. You tell the general population that Russia is now dropping white phosphorus bombs across entire cities to clear them out so that they can regain territory without having to risk any of their actual troops in doing it, and then they can just dump warm bodies in there to hold it while they move forward. That's not going to elicit the same kinds of response from the governments of those other countries are very well aware of exactly what a white phosphorus bomb would do. But the populations aren't going to be as they're not going to be as triggered by those kinds of weapons as they would be if a nuclear weapon was used. My kind of concern or my wonder about trying to annex those parts of Ukraine and then claim an invasion is so that he can set up the use of especially chemical weapons. And I'm not talking about like sarin gas type chemical weapons, but things like white phosphorus in order to try and clear things out. And that would because he can use those kinds of weapons without personnel to clear out entire swaths of area or just cause incredible amounts of damage if they don't take off, and regaining ground that way. And then he would just need the warm bodies to literally throw in the town to hold it while he can push things back. That was my kind of, do you think that's a viable tactic or a tactic that he might be thinking about trying to employ?
I think there's a distinct possibility of it. The issue is how that will play in Poughkeepsie, as they used to jokingly say. It's how is that going to hit Main Street, Western Europe, United States, Canada, what have you. And I think if the Ukrainians continue to exercise the same kind of really advanced level thinking in terms of informational warfare techniques, that they could definitely use that to their advantage. It might not be a trigger full NATO intervention, but I could easily see something like that being a trigger for a no-fly zone being declared over Ukraine or something like that. So it's a step short of full commitment, but it's enough to say, we're serious, stop this crap. And the reason I think it unlikely that NATO would kind of sit back and say, oh, well, is that this is their, the what do you call it, the Sudeten crisis for 38 of Hitler, brinksmanship right up to the line of war and everybody caving, and everybody has understood that kind of conciliatory, or there's a term for it. It's
appeasement.
Escaping. Thank you. Appeasement. That kind of appeasement behavior doesn't work because all it really does is encourage the bad guy to do it again and again and again. So at what point do you say enough is enough? Is it when they attack Poland? Is it when they attack France or Germany? You have to wait till they bomb New York before somebody's going to do something. And I think at this point, having seen the evidence of what he being Putin has done, I think they've drawn that line in the sand. And it's important to look at this in the context of other activities that have gone before it, which we basically stood back and said, nah, we're not going to get involved. We had the war with Georgia. We had other wars with other smaller countries down in the Caucasus regions. Then you had the earlier seizure of Crimea. At any point, he could have said, okay, I'm done. I've secured my territorial ambitions. The borders are secured. But he doesn't. He just keeps pushing. And I think the Western leaders have come to the realization that they're not going to be able to buy him off. They're not going to see him stop because he's achieved his ambitions. His ambitions are to recreate the Soviet Union. recreate the Warsaw Pact with tributary client states, all of it. And I think they understand that if he does something like that, they need to take action. That's why I think it's unlikely he will do it, because I think he knows that's the risk.
So everybody can, sleep a little bit better at night, not worrying quite about all of Eastern Europe blowing up
again,
in a big radioactive glow.
Yeah, as I've caveated every time I say these, my predictions for the future are based on the rational man actor. And if you discount that and you say Putin is whack job and he doesn't care about what the consequences of his actions are, then all bets are off. Could he throw white phosphorus? Sure. Could he drop sarin? Sure. Could he drop a couple of nukes? I still think, if he really wants to make a demonstrable back off or else, I think dropping one or two tactical nukes, and when I say tactical, I don't mean taking out Kiev or Lvov or what have you. I mean, at the front lines, hitting legitimate military targets inside the areas that he's now declared to be part of Russia, just as a test measure to see how far he can push things before NATO does something. I think that is, in some ways, more likely than trying to drop white phosphorus on, the recently liberated Kharkov or on Kiev or something. I think that there's a difference there.
Well, I appreciate that.
Tactical nukes do have the advantage of being relatively safer than like an ICBM. Let's wipe out an entire frickin' city, because they can do an airburst tactical nuke, and that actually greatly minimizes like radioactive fallout and things like that. So at least we can do that. I am not entirely convinced Russia can pull that off.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not too well versed in that aspect, so I can't really comment on it. But they do have smaller yield weapons that can, like a 1 kiloton device being used somewhere.
Well, and I do appreciate, and I want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. The reason we ask you these questions is because you can make the most educated guess of anyone that I know, and have far more experience with this kind of thing. But if anyone could predict with certainty what he's going to do, would be able to counter it ahead of time, and we wouldn't be in this mess.
Although, I have to admit this much. Having looked at everything that has gone on, so I have the benefit of, seeing everything that's happened this far. I'm almost of the opinion now that you could put a monkey in front of a glass bowl and just pull out scenario slips at random, and it's just as likely to happen as anything else you could think of. I mean, it's great having very knowledgeable people, but it doesn't seem, like you mentioned, you base most of your opinions and things and possibilities off of the rational thinker, and I'm not in his head. I don't live in Russia. I barely remember the Soviet Union at all. So maybe it's just because of my point of view of not having seen any of that, grown up with it, I've had to learn a hell of a lot about Russia, just in the last 6 months, because I didn't really know anything about it. But he still doesn't strike me as making rational decisions. So, it's like I'm not entirely sure that we should give him the entire benefit of being a rational thinker or actor in this, because it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, but again, I think trying to predict the actions of an irrational thinker are literally impossible, because it falls into the category of monkey drawing slips of paper out of a bowl. Yeah.
All right.
Well, hopefully,
there's
some rationality that still persists there, and we can find I hope that the situation can be resolved. by whatever means it needs to be resolved before there's any kind of massive escalation that could have potential repercussions involving the entire world. And of course, the Ukraine and its people don't really deserve this. I mean, I wasn't particularly impressed with Ukraine as a country before, very corrupt, still some signs of corruption going on even now, but at least their informational war is hella on point. So they're kicking Russia's ass when it comes to informational warfare. But and they're apparently kicking their ass just generally, which is shocking. Nobody expected that 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So I'm really hoping that a resolution is found, because what's going on over there is absolutely horrendous just from a humanitarian point of view.
Absolutely.
And thanks for lending us your vast expertise to at least try. So I really didn't want to have to propose that we actually rent a monkey in a bowl and just start throwing ideas in there. It does seem a little. I
have one available cheap.
Well, if he were going to do that, he would just have me sit in front of the camera and start pulling slips out.
You could do that, or would have him be producing the show. It couldn't hurt. All right. Well, so I'll get in touch with you about the monkey. So thank you all for joining us. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to have Operator 𝗲𝗲 on. He is a Ukrainian National Guardsman. We're going to talk about what he's been seeing, what's going on in the army, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, what's the situation just from somebody who is in Ukraine right now, living it. We're going to be speaking with him, Commander McMillan, and 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐴𝐺 will be joining us for that. So I hope you guys will be able to. We would love to see you there. Please join us tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern. Also, you can catch up with our discussions on this on the Discord, and the link to that is in the description, and hopefully we'll be dropping that in just a minute in the live chat. Come join us. You can ask questions, see how we put our shows together, and overall just keep up with the news in the same way that we do. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our talk with Operator 𝗲𝗲. Thank you all, and have a good night.